This is the 8th annual lecture in our distinguished public lecture series in what's now an established yearly event in the MICRA calendar. We're absolutely delighted, she's standing right behind me, to welcome Professor Christina Victor this evening, who's speaking about a topic that is of very great interest, I know, and increasing importance. And I know you've all come to hear her speak, and in a few minutes I'll be introducing her to all of you. So just to say, if you're so inclined, if you want to live tweet the event or follow it on Twitter, the hashtags are #UOMAging. We'll be using, that's University of Manchester Aging, we'll be using that hashtag all week, as I'll explain to you in a moment. And also Loneliness Later Life is particularly for this lecture. You can also follow us here at MICRA on Twitter. Please do if you're on Twitter, on MICRA Aging, and Brunel Aging Studies, which Cristina leads. You can follow on Brew Aging Stew, and you can see how that works. For those of you who don't know me, I know quite a lot of people in the room. I'm Debbie Price. I'm the third director of MICRA, having stepped into the great Chris Phillipson's shoes. He's here on my left. And building on the foundation that he and James Nasru and others have established here, really reflecting the world-leading research into aging that is going on here at the University of Manchester. At MICRA, we're absolutely convinced that developing interdisciplinary research is a key task for advancing work in the field of aging, and the University of Manchester is at the cutting edge of these new insights. Many of you also already know us, and I just want to take a moment to thank, through our management teams, Joe Garsden and Mike Leverance, the former managers of MICRA, and Joe currently on secondment to Greater Manchester, and Emma Fraser and Suzanne Booth, who you've had contact with about this evening. Thank you very much to them. They engage, as indeed do all of our researchers here, in a lot of stakeholder engagement. And if you'd like to know more about the work we do, there is a sign-up sheet outside. As you know from the million emails that would have come into your inboxes, we're no longer allowed to just send you anything. So if you want anything from us, do just take a moment to pop your name and email down. I also wanted to say that the University of Manchester is the only UK university to have social responsibility among its core strategic objectives, with staff and students alike dedicated to making a positive difference in communities around the world. This core value, I think I can speak for many of us when I say, makes a huge difference to those of us who work here in Manchester, and indeed especially to aging research here. I'm especially pleased tonight to welcome you all as part of the Conference Fringe to our 47th annual British Society of Gerontology Conference, which is being hosted for the remainder of this week here at University Place by all three Manchester universities. We will be welcoming 650 delegates to the conference from 30 countries around the world. And tonight's MICRA lecture is only one of many fringe events taking place in the city this week, including a meeting of the important Eurocities Working Group, which is a collaboration of 30 European cities who today and tomorrow will focus on what policymakers and urban planners need to engage with as a result of our aging populations. We hope you'll also have a chance to engage with the Festival of Aging around the city this week, and do pop out at some point to see the wonderful outdoor photography exhibition outside University Place that's involved people living here in Manchester. I'm absolutely delighted also to announce today, and absolutely hot off the press, that the university has been awarded funding from the NIHR to lead 2 policy research units, £5 million to each PRU, to explore how the health needs of the aging population are to be met, and to investigate how health and care systems and commissioning will look for the future. On the Older People and Frailty Policy Response Unit, Manchester will lead a consortium, including the University of Newcastle and the London School of Economics, to look at the impact of population change on health and social care, the links between frailty, disability, and multiple conditions, long-term and end-of-life care, the use of technologies, personalized care, self-care, and healthy aging. Indeed, I'm very proud to say that we have 53 scientific papers from social science and health researchers here at the university being presented at the British Society of Gerontology conference this week. Here at MICRA, we support a network of more than 300 academics who are working on research projects directly investigating aging. Many of you will already know our work on urban aging, and in particular, our substantial research agenda on social isolation and social exclusion in later life. It's so pertinent to tonight's lecture and makes a perfect segue for me to introduce you to Christina Victor from the University of Brunel, who will be talking to you tonight about loneliness in later life. I first met Cristina when I was a master's student a million years ago, and Cristina came to the University of Surrey to give a guest lecture on our program. She was quite unlike any other lecturer I had ever met, and I thought she was just fab and just the kind of thing you want in a lecturer. I can remember her saying two things, which in my ensuing years in gerontology I have never forgotten. The first was a question that she posed to us as students, which was whether her generation, which coincidentally is also my generation, as it turns out, when we might need residential care, would we be satisfied with bingo and sing-alongs, or would we be wanting heavy metal and marijuana? The second thing that she said was in response to some research she presented when a student rather tetchily asked her what the policy relevance of this research was. And she said that sometimes it's important to find things out, to produce knowledge for its own sake, for who knows what it might be relevant to in the future. And you can see just what a kind of thinker Cristina is by how relevant these two throwaway comments that I'm sure she doesn't remember, made, as I said, something like 1 million years ago, are still to our thinking today. But of course, we also welcome Cristina for her achievements in the world of gerontology. Cristina's significant canon of research has advanced our global understanding of loneliness, social isolation, ethnicity, and health and well-being in later life, and she has inspired international scholarship in these realms. She has shaped gerontological thinking, research, education, and practice through her breadth of scholarly publications and her editorial responsibilities and her research leadership positions. Cristina is recognized by policymakers, campaigners, and practitioners as providing national leadership in her chosen fields, and in particular for her noteworthy contributions to the development of the campaign to end loneliness. This work sits alongside her key role in British gerontology as the editor-in-chief of the Society's leading journal, Aging and Society, which under her editorship is now the top-ranked European journal in aging. Cristina's work has contributed to preparing health and social care practitioners for direct clinical practice, especially with older people and their families, and her continued dedication to education and mentoring of current and future generations of health and social care practitioners, as well as academic gerontologists, is appreciated by all and recognized by the Academy. In 2017, in recognition of her considerable contributions, she was awarded the British Society of Gerontology's highest honor, the 2017 Outstanding Achievement Award in Gerontology. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Christina Victor.
I was just confirming to Debbie that I remember both of those comments, except that I've moderated my view of what I need in my care home now, and substituted a swimming pool for other things. So thank you very much. It's an honour and a privilege to be here, and I'm especially pleased that some of you have forsaken the hot weather to come and listen to me talk about my pet topic. An academic with a captive audience is a challenging thing, so I shall try and keep to time. And I guess in the spirit of what the comments that Debbie made at the beginning, I want to perhaps leave you at the end of the evening with more questions than answers. So, before I get into the sort of serious part of the talk, I just want to take this opportunity to thank a lot of people who've helped and supported me in my interests in loneliness, which I developed as a very low form of human life, academic human life research assistant when I worked in Cardiff in the medical school. So a lot of people have helped me to do that, too numerous to mention. They know who they are, and I really appreciate their help, their support. I'd also like to acknowledge the funders. I've been very fortunate across my career to get funding from a range of charities and also research councils and health funders. So that funding has helped shape my ideas, but neither my collaborators nor the funders can be held responsible for my views, which are my own. So let's see if we can make it. Ooh, okay. Okay, so this is what I want to try and do in the next sort of 45 minutes. And particularly I think loneliness is a very good topic area to think about what language, how we use language, what language means. So unfortunately, there is some necessity to think about terms, terminology and definitions, because I think these help us make sense of what are perhaps sometimes contradictory statements and findings from projects, and then to go through the three things that I put up there for a title, which were around loneliness as a problem of old age, loneliness as a public health problem, and loneliness as a moral panic, in the loosest sense of the word. I will probably follow that order, so uncharacteristically, as my students would tell you. I'll try and keep going in the right order. I just need to stand back a bit, otherwise I can't focus on you guys. So let's just think first of all about loneliness. Loneliness is seen by some people as being something that is part of the human condition, that we're born lonely, we live our lives in a lonely state, and we die lonely. And that, in fact, loneliness is the factor that provokes us to seek social engagement, and that it is, in fact, part and parcel of being human. And that's one sort of take on loneliness from the philosophical perspective. And we can see this in other ways, that how we use language. So this is a really nice quote from Tillich, which I want you to kind of think about, that loneliness is the word that we use to express the pain of being alone, and solitude is to express the positive part of being alone. So the language of loneliness is I think, more complex perhaps than popular representations would have us believe, and that is perhaps, I think, one of the things I want you to think about across tonight is, if loneliness is part of the human condition, it's part of being human, it's part of something we all do, how come now it's been turned into the #1 social problem in Britain? It's been reconstructed as a medical thing, and that perhaps doctors want to prescribe things to stop us being lonely. So we can talk about loneliness. As I say, it's a very wide vocabulary, and we use it in lots of things. If anybody's got the answers, I'd really, really like to hear from you in terms of thinking about the history of the use of the word lonely and loneliness. So there was in 1674, a guy called John Ray compiled, I guess, an anti-dictionary, words that weren't used very often. And he included loneliness in his list. And he defined it as to describe the situation, both places and people. So it wasn't just to individuals, so places and people that were far away from neighbours. So I guess it's when we lived in perhaps smaller social groups, people who were lonely were people who were apart from the group and the protection that offered. And if we think about how we use loneliness today, we do talk about lonely places. So as big cities are often seen as being lonely, but particular places, so pieces of road. There's a great picture from an island in the Shetlands of what's described as the loneliest bus stop in Britain. But we can also think about it in temporal terms, so loneliness has a temporal dimension, so you can be lonely at night and particular times of year. We might come back to that in a minute. We can think about it in terms of life stages, so somebody reflecting they perhaps had a lonely youth, and we can think about it as in different groups and populations. So we might describe somebody as being lonely. So just to get rid of some of the stereotypes, here you can see loneliness being used to describe, in fact, elite swimmers. And that's a theme that might emerge across the evening. Not the elite part, but the swimmers part. So, I just want you to take a moment to consider the truth of the universality of loneliness. So, it is something most of us experience at some time across our life. I'm not going to ask you to hand in your answers, although, because I haven't got permission from the ethics committee, but okay, so just want you to take a moment to think about a time when you felt lonely. And to think about the duration of that experience. Was it something fleeting, or was it something that perhaps endured for a period of time, perhaps a life transition? And what, if anything, was the trigger? Was it being in a particular time? Was it being in a particular place? Was it listening to something on the radio? Anybody who's under 25 doesn't know what one of those is, look it up on Wikipedia. Was there a particular trigger? I'm sure all of you could answer all of those questions. So for me, the rather obscure pictures here of when I was a kid, I was a serious swimmer, and now I'm older, I still swim, but not as seriously. So I used to compete, and now I take part. So if you ask me to reflect on what is the time when I feel extremely lonely, and it's standing on the starting blocks. So I can't see the pictures, but here you can see starting blocks as they used to be, and here you can see I still can't start. So for me, I train with a group, I have a coach, we work together in a lane. When you go to a competition, there's the hideous moment when the referee calls the swimmers onto the starting block. And for me, that is absolutely the time at which I would rather be anywhere else other than there. But however, that doesn't stop me from doing it. On Saturday, I swam in a swimming competition and did 18 kind of different races. So I had to get on the block 18 times, and it was hideous 18 times. So, if I asked you, that's my take on loneliness. It has a particular setting, a particular context. I'm sure if I asked you to share your stories, they would also be personalised and specific. And that is one of the issues when we're thinking about loneliness, and we talk about loneliness as a health problem, a problem of old age. We assume a homogeneity of experience. We assume that loneliness is the same for everyone, that it's felt in the same way, and that it's experienced in the same way, in the same circumstances. And I think one of the things in research terms and policy and practice terms is that we talk about personalised medicine in other domains, but how we experience, understand and respond to loneliness, I think, is something where I'm sure there are patterns, but it isn't as homogeneous as we might wish to think. So I think you're spared any more hideous pictures of me swimming. So I guess what is interest to me, as somebody who's had a sort of a career thinking about loneliness, is how and why we are now in the position where we talk about loneliness as an epidemic. We have strategies and interventions to combat it, and we, in a sense, I think, have problematized loneliness in the same way that we have with some other aspects, perhaps women would argue, around childbirth. We've decided it's a problem, and it's not just a social problem, it's a big health problem. And I don't have the answers, but I want to perhaps look a bit critically at how robust the representations that we see there, and we see them all the time, about loneliness being more than a misfortune, but being something much more problematic. Right, so we've nearly done with the kind of tedious definitions and thinking about language, but it is important to be able to differentiate what loneliness is and what it isn't. So this is a classic example of an academic. Academics are good at doing two things in general, one of which is stating the blindingly obvious, and the second is making something that's incredibly obvious and straightforward much more complicated than you could ever imagine. So loneliness, I think, is a good example of this. It's really important to differentiate between what we have here of, as it were, 5 different words, 5 different phrases that are used, one of which is loneliness, and the other 4 are things that are linked to loneliness or might be related to it but aren't it. So, that whilst we can debate in detail how we define loneliness, and there are different theoretical positions, the sort of broadly accepted and internationally used sort of definition of loneliness is it represents the perceptual gap individuals have between the social relationships they would like to have and the ones that they actually have. So it's a discrepancy between what you would like and what you have. And that discrepancy can be in a number of different dimensions. You may have a lot of social relationships, but they don't give you the quality of social relationships that you want. Alternatively, you may have very few social relationships, but they give you everything you need. So I use the anecdote of my mother, who sadly is now dead, who was widowed, lived on her own in a street where the population had changed, so she didn't know anybody particularly, not because the new young families that were in the houses where she lived were uncaring. It was just everybody was out at work trying to pay the mortgage and keep their households together. So she was, to many people externally, a lonely old lady, to the degree that she used to get the befrienders come round, and because they decided she was lonely. Her social network was small, so it was me, one niece, and her grandson. And 1/3 of that network were a bit redundant, which was me. The person who really mattered in my mother's life was her grandson, so my son. And that relationship with him, and it gave her everything she needed. So that's a very good example, I think, of somebody whose network to external observers, she looked like a lonely old lady. To those of us who knew her, she was not at all lonely. She was very happy with the social contact she had. Not because she had low expectations, but because the relationships she had were the ones that mattered. And so that's where loneliness is quite a tricky issue to sometimes examine, because it's very dependent upon the individual. So perhaps something, again, going back to a point I made earlier, we don't think about so much. So that's what I'm interested in. But there are other related concepts. So the idea of isolation is related but not the same. Isolation is typically characterized as being the number of people in your social network. So if we go back to my mum had a very small social network. She was probably isolated, but she wasn't lonely. So isolation is a bit like counting up the number of contacts rather than thinking about perhaps the meaningfulness of those concepts. Then we have living alone. So quite often, and some of the, you've got to pay attention and remember these things now, because some of these words are going to appear later. So living alone is exactly what it says. It describes the number of people you live with. So again, go back to my mum, she lived alone. So her household was one person. We know that people live alone are more likely to be lonely, but the relationship is not to the degree to which they are interchangeable concepts. So there's one more, I guess, that's important, and that, I think, is one that's neglected. We think about the people living alone. We don't think so much about the amount of time people spend on their own. And I think that, as researchers, is something perhaps we've neglected to incorporate in our work in the degree to which we could. So you may live in a large family, you may live in a large household, you might live in a care home. You're surrounded by people, but you may in fact spend significant amounts of time thinking on your own, being alone. So I think that's an important one we neglect. So if you think about some of the families I interviewed when I worked at the University of Reading, where we had people who had come to the UK from Bangladesh and Pakistan. People lived in 3 generational households. I think probably most people, if you'd stop them in the street, would not assume that anybody who lived with 3 generations of their family in the same house would be lonely. But if you think about it, if you think about some of the family situations for a moment, if you're the grandparents in the house, the middle generation are probably out at work, the children are out at school. So potentially, if you have a widowed grandmother or grandfather in a multi-generational household, they may spend lots of time on their own. And I think we sometimes forget to factor that in. Solitude, if we go back to the idea of Tillich, is when we choose to spend time on our own. And a bit of shameless publicity that somebody called Barbara Taylor from Queen Mary College in London has got a very nice large research grant to look at solitude. So the positive aspects of being alone. But these are the sort of academic definitions, and what do older people themselves think about loneliness, and how do they describe it? Perhaps something we, again, as researchers, have neglected to investigate to the degree that we might have done. This is some quotations from some work I undertook with my colleague Mary Pat Sullivan, who now, in order to escape my endless ranting on about loneliness, had to take a job in Canada, and Mike Thomas, who works with me at Brunel University. And you can see some obvious things. So bereavement and how very profound that can be in disrupting people's social networks. Loneliness is not having somebody to talk to. Loneliness is people not coming to visit. So if you don't entertain, I'm sorry about that, you're probably lonely, according to that respondent. I think the one that perhaps stands out for me in those definitions is the penultimate one at the bottom, which I think goes back to the meaningfulness of relationships that are at the heart of what I think loneliness is about. And this respondent was talking about nobody to care for, not in the sense of being, well, potentially being in the sense of, but somebody who cares about you. Nobody to care for you and nobody for you to care about. And I think that's very apposite. And we also, I think, we academically understand loneliness as a temporal and a spatial experience. But again, perhaps we don't always think about it because it doesn't fit with neat policy solutions and the desire to quantify things. So this is some work that I did with Kate Bennett from Liverpool University. And again, you can see people talking about loneliness being something that they experience at night, something that's experienced at the weekend, and some things perhaps we might not think about how people experience their domestic environment. So a woman talking about saying she never sat on her own because her husband had always been there. And another one saying he sat in the chair here and she sat in the chair somewhere else. And so again, loneliness, I think, is an intensely personal experience. We can develop generalizations and think about it in a macro level, but it is a personal experience. And I think we need, when we're thinking about it, when we see it represented in the media, perhaps need to think about some of the complexities underlying the presentation. So, but of course, if you're interested in public health, the one thing you have to be able to do if you're a real public health practitioner is to measure something. You need to know how big it is. If you're the director of public health for Hillingdon, where Brunel University is based, you basically want to know, is this problem big? So do I need to worry about it? Is it an irritating one in the middle, or is it a small one I don't need to worry about? So there is an interest in quantifying loneliness, but also these other dimensions of social relationships. So this is, the quotation is from one of our participants from the previous study, saying, well, I think it's a bit difficult to quantify, and maybe you can't do it at all because it's something which is intensely personal to oneself, but that doesn't stop the mindless empiricists amongst us from having a go. And what we would like to measure, if we go back to perhaps my frivolous example of the swimming competitions, we want to know how intense is the feeling of loneliness. Is it mild, or is it, when I'm on the starting block, absolutely overwhelming? How long does it last? Well, in that example, a very short period between the referee getting you on the starting blocks and the starter starting the race. How often does it happen? Every time I get on a starting block. So I think if we're going to think about loneliness, we need to think about those different dimensions. And you can see that coming out in the kinds of quotations people gave us. So most of our measures of loneliness deal with frequency. And there are a number of different camps about how you should measure it. I'll save you the tedious kind of academic discussions on that. Essentially, the very first study of loneliness that was done in Britain that I can find used a self-rating scale, which basically you pitch up and ask somebody, well, how often do you feel lonely? And then you may put a reference about it in the last month, in the last week, or whatever, and people are given a range of options to do. So that's a very direct way. There are other ways of measuring loneliness that I like in varying degrees, where we ask people questions which we think tap into the concept of loneliness but don't use the L word. So these are a number of scales. There's something called the UCLA scale, so University of California at Los Angeles. Brunel University, Los Angeles, perhaps I made the wrong choice there. So that was developed in California, and then the de Jongerveld scale, which is a scale developed for older people by a European colleague. So I'm not going to talk too much about measurement, but it's just to alert you that there are different ways and different techniques for doing it, and we'll have a look at some of those later on. But as with all things, the answer you get to some degree depends on the question that you ask. So this is just to reinforce the point. This is a loneliness map. In case you can't recognise it, that's the London Borough of Hillingdon. I haven't got a pointer, but if you can see a nice white bit in the middle, that's the university. None of us are lonely. All the people who live down near Heathrow are very lonely. And they may be more lonely, I guess, if we have another runway. But as you can see here, this is a map that is generated by Age UK. You can go onto the Age UK website and get the loneliness map for wherever you happen to live. And this is an example of some text, not from Age UK, I hasten to add, a local authority that had used their map, and they were saying loneliness maps are being used to find and help solitary people. As research says, being alone is as harmful as 15 cigarettes a day. We'll come to the second part of that in a bit. But this map it doesn't measure loneliness, it measures factors that are associated with loneliness. So marital status, age, health status, and household size. And how this map is described, it's about finding people who are solitary, not lonely. So you can see in a lot of the ways, or at least I hope you can see, a lot of the text that's used allegedly to describe loneliness may be describing proxy measures or may be describing completely different concepts. So that's a bit of a health warning when you read things. So, having set up the sort of background, get you tuned into the loneliness language, what it is and what it isn't. When I first started as I say, as a researcher at the medical school in Cardiff, loneliness, I think, was seen as being a problem of old age. It was something that old people experienced. And these are just a few random collections from my loneliness images folder on Dropbox. And here we are, kind of a miserable looking man, miserable looking woman. The picture from the Times, it's a really miserable looking man. It doesn't come out particularly well, but there's a really miserable looking dog in there somewhere as well. And I think the Times headline, I hope you can read it, says 250,000 elderly Britons alone and lonely at Christmas. So again, this is another example of, if you like, terminological inexactitude. Public health people don't like numbers by themselves. 250,000 out of, so we need a numerator and a denominator. So just saying a big number makes you think it's a big problem. If it's 250,000 out of 500,000, it's a big problem. If it's 250,000 out of 10 million, it's probably not such a big problem. And we'll come back to that again. And you can see these elderly Britons are alone and lonely. So this is the classic social research methods question. You put in a question in your questionnaire, do you drink and smoke? If somebody says yes to that, do they drink, do they smoke, or do they do both? So is this about people who live alone, people who are lonely, or is it both? So there's a lot of, but anyway, this is the sort of typical representation, probably up until about 2010, of loneliness. And in particular, loneliness at Christmas is a big industry now, and I'm very sad. Everybody who knows me, the moment they get their first appeal letter from an age-related charity for loneliness at Christmas, they drop me an email. I won the competition last year. I got it on the 29th of September. So So typical representation, probably from the post-war period, has been loneliness as a problem of old age. It's something for older people. And this is from the Roundtree report, 1947, and the survey that underpinned this is by a guy called Sheldon. And you can see here, a distressing feature of old age is loneliness. All who've done welfare work have found it the most common, if at the same time the most imponderable of the ills from which the aged suffer. So here we have loneliness, it's a problem of old age. Now, if we're thinking about that, kind of complexity alert, Christina's going to make it more complicated for you. So I think when we want to understand the experience of loneliness, there are a number of different ways we can do it. So the most traditional way we do it is to look at, we think loneliness is something that affects older people, and we've expended a lot of time, effort and trouble on working out which groups are the most lonely. So is it the widowed? Is it left-handed people? Is it people who live in gated communities? So which groups are most vulnerable to the experience? And we do age-related comparisons. So I'll go back a bit. Peer group studies are basically what we do. Researchers have been dead interested to find out who's the most lonely. It's like a competition. I'm lonelier than you kind of thing. We've done very little in terms of thinking, if people are lonely in old age, is that something they've experienced across their life course, or is it a new thing? So that's age-related loneliness. Is this something they've experienced in old age? And then there are two other areas where we haven't done as much work, but it's getting now. One of which is to say, the British population consists of more than older people, although sometimes you'd be hard-pressed to realise it from some of the press reports. But one interesting thing is, if we want to test out the proposition that loneliness is a problem of old age, then perhaps we ought to compare it with some other groups to see if that's really true. And then from a public health point of view, and I'll come back to this later, for something to be a public health problem, generally you would expect it to be getting bigger, increasing. So are older people lonelier now than they were at previous points in our history? So this is some data about loneliness from the 2016 European Social Survey. I hope you can see it on the I don't know which way the slides are. On my left, we have people aged 15 to 24, and at the far side, we have people aged 75 and over. And the bars we're interested in all of the bars. So the light blue bar is loneliness. So these are people who've said, I'm often lonely in response to a question. And what have we got there? About 9% of people aged over 75 say that they're lonely. And if we work across the generations, we can see, yes, that is the most, but not particularly by much. So young adults are perhaps the next highest group in terms of risks of loneliness. So is loneliness exclusive to older people? Not individually, but in population terms, depending on how you draw the age bands, young adults are as vulnerable as older people. And the other thing we notice is that if we look at people aged 65 and over, you can see around about 70% of people are not lonely. And so one of the interesting questions that I've tried to answer and dismally failed to achieve, I just need a few more £1 million and 10 more years and I'll crack it, which is why, however you do the analysis, the majority of older people are not lonely. So we spend a lot of time trying to find out who is lonely, but we never ask the counter question, well, how come the other 70% aren't? What is it about them? And then you can see the red bars, who are the kind of irritating people who can't perhaps make up their mind. So loneliness is not the exclusive province of older people. everybody can experience, but if we think about it of populations, probably it's the extremes of the age distribution. Those young people perhaps making the transition from dependence and living with their parents to becoming independent, and older people having other transitions, perhaps retirement, bereavement, changes in health status. So it's not just the province of the young. So I'm going to skip over the next one because I was really interested in that when I was on the train, but I've changed my mind now. So those data I just showed you in the graph are cross-sectional data. So we go out, stop all the people on the Oxford Road and say, how would you rate your loneliness? And I'm sure they'd all be very delighted to answer my questions. But actually that just tells us about now. It doesn't tell us about what's happened in the past or perhaps how it may change in the future. And that's one of the limitations of a lot of the research that I'm going to come on to in a bit, which is why perhaps our claims for the deleterious effects of loneliness are perhaps overstated. They may be correct, but perhaps we're just getting carried away with ourselves. If we look at people longitudinally, so now we've got longitudinal studies, we can take a group of people and we can follow them over time, and we can make them ask more questions about loneliness every time we see them. So where we've got the data about changes over 10 years, these are people who are participating in the English longitudinal study of ageing. The Manchester Friends are very big friends with ELSA. And so if we look at people, we follow the same people up, so they haven't dropped out or died or just gone off to the Caribbean for a few months. We can follow them up over 10 years, and 70% of people are not lonely at any time you interview them. Well, we interview them every 2 years. And then you have some other groups. You have people who are always lonely at every time point. So you think, well, perhaps they're a particularly problematic group. And then you've got a certain amount of flux. So you've got people who are moving in and out of loneliness, and they're another interesting group. And one of the groups who I used to think of as being irritating, but I've decided that actually they're potentially the most interesting people, are the people who fluctuate. The people when you go, say, a baseline, they may not have been lonely, 2 years later they are. And perhaps if we were thinking about people for whom we might want to think about intervening, if we thought that was a good idea, potentially they might be the group that one might want to think about. The people who are bumping around on the margins of loneliness. Perhaps those who've been lonely all their life are a different issue. So I've got some data where we asked people, again, over 65, and this is some work I did with Anne Bowling, so thank you, Anne, where we asked people to think about, to rate their loneliness 10 years ago and what they thought was going to happen in the future. And I think perhaps the most interesting things are that people could see it going in either direction. So a lot of people didn't think there was going to be any change. Some groups thought they might be more lonely, and that might be a reasonable hypothesis, given if you have health problems, or perhaps if you have taken on board a lot of the ageist stereotypes that we all think old people should be lonely, so I better behave like a lonely old person. But as you can see there, we've got 20% or so who think, 23%, nearly a quarter, who think, actually I'm going to be less lonely in the future. And so who are they and what's going on there? So I think it's very important that we don't see lonely old age as being a one-way journey. Perhaps when you're, I don't know, if you're in a terrible job and you didn't like the people you worked with and you didn't feel you could engage with them, and you retire and then you can spend all your time in the Manchester Aquatic Centre, you might not be lonely at all. So I think that's quite instructive to us who perhaps can get on a set of tram rails taking us in a single direction. So then there's this idea of, is loneliness increasing? Is it getting better? You read the press, it must be getting worse. It's an epidemic. It's getting bigger. We're all online. Nobody talks to anybody. We have to have slow shopping lanes so that we can have social contact. So I was very fortunate enough to get some funding from ESRC to go and repeat the survey and repeat, and I hesitate to say develop, but certainly use in a different way the work done by Sheldon and Townsend, who are the people who did the original work. So I used exactly the same question in very similar populations. And you can see, if you look at the group who are always often lonely, that is incredibly consistent. However much you try, if you use that question, you get the same answer, which is flies in the face, perhaps, of some expectations. Where there is a change, there has been a change, is in the sometimes group. So when Sheldon did his work, there weren't many people who were sometimes lonely. Now there's a bit more, but I've repeated it again, and it goes back to about 25%. So this is a remarkably stable finding, which again, perhaps we might want to hold in our minds when we think perhaps about the representations of older people and the representations of the communities in which they live, that we don't care for our older relatives and we don't care for older people. And the final bit of data, before kind of going into the final two bits of my talk, I could see some of you when I had my little diagram of loneliness and isolation are two different things. Yes, they are. So this is a series of data sets where we've characterized people as being lonely and isolated, lonely, isolated, or none of them. So again, we get the same problem, but as you can see, in fact, most people are not lonely or isolated. Generally, around about 15 of 20% of people are characterized as isolated. If you measure total social contacts, around about 9% of people are lonely, and a very small minority of people are both. So empirically and conceptually, these are two different things. So when you see whichever newspaper of your choice using loneliness and isolation interchangeably, you go, aha. Terminological inexactitude. You can't do it. They're not the same thing at all. So, I want to think about loneliness not as a problem of old age, but as it is, I think, increasingly represented as a public health problem. So it's kind of tricky to decide what is a public health problem, because it used to be easy infectious diseases, and people like my hero John Snow. That's not the news guy. It's John Snow, who was a doctor in the 1840s in London, who worked out that cholera was a waterborne infectious disease. So public health problems used to be contagious, and that's how we used to describe an epidemic. And now we do it more, we use the terms more creatively. But in order to be a public health problem, there are another number of conditions. It generally is something that's getting bigger. Oh my Lord, everybody's dying of lung cancer. What are we going to do about it? Answer, stop them smoking. So if you take the example of lung cancer, Richard Doll and colleagues noted that there was an increase in lung cancer deaths in the post-war period. They worked back from that to think not only is that a bad thing for individuals, it's a bad thing for society, and worked out that actually the issue was smoking. So if we think about lung cancer as a public health problem, it has big consequences for the individual, you die. It has big consequences for society, not a good thing for your family, the economy, all sorts of other things. But if we couldn't, we can identify it, and we could prevent it by stopping people smoking, or we could do something about it. So generally, public health problems are something where they're increasing. It has negative outcomes for individuals and societies, and it's identifiable, preventable, or treatable. So, is the prevalence of loneliness increasing? No, it isn't. What is changing in absolute terms, there are more older people who are lonely because there are more older people. But if you think that fulfills the inclusion criteria, that's fine. But in terms of it, so it's growing in absolute terms, but not in relative terms. What are the consequences of loneliness? Loneliness is said to be an exposure that is comparable to smoking and obesity. And I really love the quote from the Mail Online, which I hope you can read, and I have to move so I can read it, which says, loneliness and feeling unloved twice as likely to kill you than being fat. I'm not sure if that reassures people whose BMI is slightly high, but maybe it doesn't. Okay? And then, apropos of nothing, there's ... Scientists warn against elderly retiring to sunnier climes. So we're not going to have snowbirds coming to Manchester. It's bad for us. So loneliness is now tagged as being a cause of concern that is of the same magnitude of smoking. And that's a pretty high bar, because smoking is seriously bad for you, which is why we've kind of stopped doing it by and large and decided it's not a good thing. So, and I'm sceptical of that. I'm not sceptical of this. Loneliness for older people compromises well-being. So, you don't need to necessarily worry about what the scores mean. You can just see that people who are not lonely have higher scores on well-being measures than people who aren't. Loneliness and low levels of well-being are really, really well correlated. So if you are interested in well-being, you should be interested in loneliness. We need to think about which way the direction goes. But that, for me, in and of itself, loneliness is not good for older people or younger people because it compromises their well-being. If we're interested in the citizens of our country having a good life, loneliness is going to compromise that. And for me, some of the relationships with other outcomes which try to equivalate loneliness with cigarette smoking or being inactive or a number of other things are just specious. For me, in and of itself, that is enough. But anyway, so this seems to me, this is some work from Julianne Holt-Lundstad, and is one of the pieces of work that is used to has been used to reframe how we think about loneliness and characterise it as a public health problem. I can't go into the details because I haven't got a pointer, and just waving my finger at it won't kind of help you. But effectively, what she did was take all of a load of studies about social relationships, so measured all sorts of different types of social relationships, measured loneliness, measured social isolation, measured the quality of your relationships, and calculated an odds ratio of how more likely you were to die if you had a denuded social relationships. And then said, so that's absolutely fine. And then said, and that's equivalent to the kind of odds ratio you get for smoking, which is absolutely true. It is. But what we don't know, but that gets misconstrued as it's the same of. So what I think she's trying to say, it's an effect that's of the same magnitude. But of course, what we don't know, because most of the studies didn't do it, are the people who are lonely smokers. So are they more likely to die, not because they're lonely, but because they smoke? So it's, I think, a very catchy headline. It gets you your research grants, but I think it's perhaps been misused, and I think she's been kind of misquoted a bit on that. So I can talk more about that at length if anybody wants to do it. And we have similar issues, and I'm only going to focus on one of them. We see here, feeling lonely increases Alzheimer's risk. So that's dementia linked to loneliness, study finds. And these kinds of representations, potentially, I think, can be quite frightening. If you're a lonely older person, you read the headline there, you think, oh my Lord, not only am I lonely, I'm demented as well. So I think we have to be careful and responsible in how we present our science. So I've looked at a number of studies, and I won't go into too much details, extremely limited evidence where we've taken people who were dementia-free at baseline, divided them into people who are lonely and people who are not, followed them up over time, and looked to see whether people who are lonely are more likely to develop dementia than not. There is only one study that's ever done that, so it's not a huge literature. And again, we need to think about what could be the biological mechanism. How does that work? And we also need to think, and I'm sorry because this is turning into my research methods lecture, and that's what we need to think in all of these studies, and when we're thinking about loneliness and all other outcomes, how do we measure that outcome? Dementia's a kind of tricky thing to diagnose. So there are three ways that studies use, sort of social science, public health studies use to decide, characterize people as having dementia. One of which is you have a clinician. So we have a clinician in the audience, and we send the clinicians round to assess people, give them a clinical diagnosis of dementia. That's kind of expensive, time-consuming, and studies generally don't have the ability to do that. So we have a number of screening tools, things like the mini mental state test, where you give some people a series of questions, you add them up, there's a threshold and varying categories, and you can say, well, this person has impaired cognitive function or not. And then there's a third way we do it, which is in things like ELSA and some of the large surveys, we go in, we don't have clinicians, we don't have time to do the mini mental state test, so we get people to recall things. So we get them to repeat back a list of words, get them to list the number of animals that they can recall in 10 minutes, or in a minute after a period of time. And a lot of the studies that associate loneliness with dementia are these ones where we're using word recall. So you'll find that after 4 years follow-up, people who are lonely, let's say, can remember or recall 8.2 words in their minute, and somebody who isn't lonely can recall 8.9. And that's a statistically significant difference because these things are mega. But that doesn't mean the individual has dementia. It may suggest a number of things, but I'm very, I think we need to be reflective about some of those data, because what does half a word difference in recall mean to the individual's ability to live independently in the community? Now, if it crosses a threshold, it may be significant. But if it doesn't, I think we need to be wary of labelling that as dementia. So, this is just a table which I'm happy to discuss later on to show you that actually, if we compare people on two screening tools for loneliness, they don't correlate. They correlate a bit, but they don't correlate well enough. So if we wanted to screen people for loneliness, we don't have a gold standard like we might do for cervical cancer, where you can do a biopsy. Loneliness is what people think it is. And it's difficult to develop a screening test that can do that. I want to talk a little bit about, if we want to do something about loneliness, what can we do about it? We know a lot of risk factors, but a lot of the risk factors for loneliness are not modifiable. So the biggest risk factor we know is widowhood. Now, if we look at this table here, these are people again from ELSA. Now remember, widowhood is the biggest predictor. So we can take people who are married, not lonely at one wave, they're bereaved between waves, and then we can follow up what happens to them. And even in the wave immediately post bereavement, half of them are lonely and half of them aren't. So if you were going to think about an intervention and you were going to focus on widows, you know, perhaps you might think, I'll get people when they go to register a death, because I'm a sensitive public health practitioner, and I'll recruit them into an intervention trial. Even if you did that, the group that's the most vulnerable, you're gonna miss. You're only going to get 50% hit rate, which is not kind of good. So I can talk about that more at length. And then, is the condition treatable? I think my reading of the evidence is that evidence to support the effectiveness of interventions for loneliness is not robust, I think. And I'm absolutely certain that whatever the problem is, chickens are not the answer. Okay? In my advanced directive, which I've got there, it's no politicians, no royalty, no people of faith, and absolutely no animals of any variety. Okay? We don't have a very sophisticated understanding of loneliness in terms of how it varies with individuals, how it waxes and wanes, what the risk factors may be, and so why we think we can intervene when we don't know how to find the people who are lonely in the first place, I think is problematic. I think it's very interesting that we have a Minister for Loneliness, but I'm not sure whether it's helpful or not. Okay, so I'm just going to put a quote up from Jeremy Hunt just because I can, and I think he, as Health Secretary, is guilty of, again, what my Professor of Public Health at St George's used to call numerator epidemiology. So, wow, there are 800,000 people in England are chronically lonely, but there's 60 million of them, so who is that? So he's just there because I think he's there, and he's just there, again, because I could. And he, I don't know whether you can read that there. Along the bottom it says, I'm struck by the reverence and respect for older people in Asian culture. And I just happened at the same time to see failure to visit parents now a crime in China, and just thought it was interesting. We have stereotypes not just about how we think and care about older people, but how other countries do it. And for me, some of the comments from some ministers where they talk about how we neglect our care for older people actually do not read their research reports that they commission. So I'm going to think about it. My final couple of slides, and I thank you for your patience, is that I think it's stepped up a notch. Loneliness is a problem of old people. Loneliness is a public health problem. You know, these willful lonely people are developing health problems that are equivalent to smoking. Let's just stop it. So now I think we have these kinds of narratives. Consequences of loneliness are increasing, unremitting demand on healthcare, which will ultimately cripple the NHS. So the NHS is not going to fail because we haven't trained enough doctors, we don't have enough qualified staff, it's because it's going to be full of lonely old people. And here you can see, loneliness forces older people into hospitals. Lonely elderly make 30 million GP visits a year just for company. And I do think, this is great. If you want to profile your research, but, there's kind of a moral kind of issue here. So here we are, tackling loneliness epidemic could cut GP waiting times, blah, yeah. So these are the data that are given. So lonely older people are 1.8 times more likely to visit their GP, and I could go on. the quality of this evidence is not great. So the evidence around loneliness being a contributory factor in primary care consultations comes from a study published in the west of from the west of Scotland that was published in 1999. So this is not a criticism of the authors of the study, that they did the best thing they could, which is they surveyed people who were registered with a GP, asked them if they're lonely, and then asked them how many GP visits they'd had in the previous year, and put the two together. Now, one thing we can be absolutely certain of is that most people have not got the faintest idea how many times they went to the GP in the previous year. So a lot of our data where we're saying there are health consequences of loneliness in terms of service use are based on people's recall. And I'm really sorry to tell you, we're all rubbish at it. So we don't have an accurate measure of health outcomes. But hopefully somebody will give me the money to do it one day. So it's very limited evidence that we have there. And it's, I think, that was the detail. And so we have this other one as well. Lonely elderly people make 30 million GP visits a year, just for company. Well, they might be going for other reasons, you know. I mean, my GP's never that chatty, he's too busy looking at the screen. But anyway, perhaps theirs are better. So here we have a number. So we need a denominator, 30 million out of. So in England, there are roughly round about 350 million GP visits a year. That's quite a lot. And roughly, so this is back of an envelope calculation, so we don't do back of a fag packet one anymore because you can't buy them. So roughly, if you take it around about 120 million GP visits are taken up by older people. So even if 30 million are for loneliness, this is probably at best 26%. How did we get the figure of what proportion of visits are due to loneliness? Well, a survey asked the GPs to say, you know, thinking about how many patients a day come and consult you for loneliness. You know, is it 1 to 5 or 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 or more? So it isn't, these data about GP visits come from GPs saying, oh, I think it's about that much. So this is not a criticism of the methods, it's not a criticism of the GPs, it's how these data are then taken up and interpreted. And so, you'll be pleased to know, I'm nearly there. So is loneliness a problem of old age? So, well, older people have the highest levels of loneliness, or roughly have levels of loneliness equivalent to young people. So definitely those two age groups are the ones that are most vulnerable. So as a gerontologist, professionally, I've no interest in anybody under 70, and my students will tell you that. You're not old enough for me yet. But if we think about our young people, then if those data are correct, we perhaps need to think about loneliness. If we think we should do something about it, we might want to think about doing something about it earlier rather than waiting until later life. I think in terms of being a true public health problem, loneliness doesn't really fit the criteria. It's a nice label for attracting attention. It's perhaps nice to think about things other than smoking and physical activity, but the prevalence is not increasing. We don't know how to find it. We don't know what to do for people when we do find it, and we don't really know if it's bad for people. So I think we have a lot more work to do, and we might want to think about, to go back to where I started, there may well be people for whom loneliness is an incredibly debilitating experience. But for many people, it may just be part of being human. And with so many other perhaps aspects of our life, we perhaps want to be cautious about problematizing and over-medicalizing something that is perhaps, for most of us, just part of normal existence. And I think there is no really good evidence at the moment. We will be in a position, I think, in a year, 18 months, to be able to nail that down when we can do some data linkage. But at the moment, there's not much evidence for excess service use. And I think that's important. Older people are often reluctant to go and seek help. We don't want to give them another reason why they think they shouldn't perhaps go and get their arthritis treated or other conditions that they may have. We don't want them worrying that they're going to single-handedly bring about the collapse of the NHS. I think there are other people doing that much more effectively for them. But it is important, if we're thinking about people having a good life across the life course, loneliness most certainly compromises well-being. And if we think the well-being of our citizens is something that we should take seriously, then there's clearly an intergenerational research agenda around loneliness. And I'm happy to take any questions, or we can retire to the sunshine. Thank you. And he's not lonely anymore.
I'm Jane Morris. I used to work with valid older people now aged friendly in Manchester, and we've still got free swimming in Manchester for over 60s. And I myself don't bother because I like to be outdoors when I'm exercising. But I really think, especially as you're a lover of swimming, and you think you'd like to access swimming pools, even from a nursing home if you end up in one, that we need to think about access to hydrotherapy pools and swimming pools that our local authorities run, and whether and how we can enable older people to keep as active as they possibly can, no matter how alone they might be, no matter how gregarious they might be. And I would like them to be dancing, swimming, doing chair-based exercises, classes, whatever, on their own or with whoever they want to be. Can you advise us how we can make that more likely, especially for people who can't afford it, given how health inequalities increase as you get older?
I think at one point, I think there used to be a Prime Minister called Cameron. Could have been him. Yeah, I don't know. Can't imagine what he'll be remembered for. There was free swimming for older people at one point. Sadly, I was too young to benefit from it. But then it fell by the wayside. I mean, I could answer your questions in a number of different ways. I have a slightly kind of bizarre professional orientation. So I started off, I'm a failed geographer who discovered ageing through public health. So it's a kind of slightly circuitous route. So from a public health point of view, there are 4 things we should all do. Absolutely not smoke. We should eat a healthy diet. We shouldn't drink too much, and we should be physically active. And and that's why, I don't know if you can remember it, Swim England and the Alzheimer Society have an initiative for dementia-friendly swimming, so that they make facilities available during particular times for people with dementia who wish to swim. It's enormously complex. I would say that for older people, for young people, why access to physical activity, either swimming or running or football or exercises or dancing, why we I'm sounding like the aging hippie that I really am. Why we put barriers in people being able to do that in terms of price, in terms of transport, I really don't understand. If you were really interested in promoting the nation's health, then these facilities would be accessible spatially, in terms of time, and in terms of cost. I don't understand why they don't do it, but then there are so many things I don't understand. So, you know, but then somebody will say, oh, well, who's going to pay for it? Well, what do I pay my taxes for? So I don't have a simple answer, I'm afraid. I think that one of the answers I would say as well around physical activity is we have to be respectful and mindful of how people want to do it. So I'm a really bad runner, and I go to various conferences, particularly the American Gerontological Society of America, and you put your DAPs on in the morning and you go out for a run, and then all these lovely Americans will say, would you like to run with us? No thanks, I want to run by myself, because I want to kind of you know, look at the birds and the trees, or in my case, usually I find all the homeless men. So I think it's really important to respect what people want. If you want to exercise by yourself, that's great. If you want to do it with a group, that's great. We need to be able to find what works for people and make them accessible, affordable, and something people can do over the life course.
If you are in full health or if you are not in full health, such as housebound or have a disability. Also, what about the effects of faith, if a person has faith?
Okay.
Otherwise, are these not factors in learning?
Thanks. So if you didn't hear the question is, does it make a difference if you're in poor health or in good health? And does faith make a difference?
Interesting. So in terms of faith, we don't know. So that's an interesting research question. Somebody wants a project. We know that people in poor health, certain types of poor health, chronic long-term conditions, are more likely to report loneliness than people who are not in poor health. So, but of course, you don't know, that's an association, but you can't determine causation from that. So, am I lonely because I've got dementia and people won't include me in their social relationships is probably quite plausible. But loneliness causing dementia, I think, is probably less plausible.
Thanks.
Sorry, yeah.
That's okay.
Sorry.
So we'll take two more questions. I've got a lady here, but first the gentleman in white T-shirt there, and then the rest of it, we'll take these two questions. Can we take them together? Cristina will answer both of them, and then we'll all adjourn for wine. Thank you.
Okay, mine's a simple question. Is loneliness a British disease, or do foreigners have it too?
So is it a British disease?
Hi there. What an inspirational lady you are. Very similar to my views as well. I work for Tameside Council. I have for 37 years. I am actually working now in public health, but please don't shoot me for that. I'm very proud to be in Tameside because we're doing some amazing work supporting the campaign to end loneliness and the Joe Cox campaign. We got some fantastic faith groups, we've got lots of community groups who are all working together, and I'm very passionate about our older people. I would love you to come over to Tameside and see if we can do things differently. We all work in partnership, we've got a fantastic support network throughout our communities, but if you can help us a little bit further, I'm sure you can make more of a difference for our older people. Thank you.
So is loneliness a British disease? No. It's we've exported it to many parts of our friends in Europe and North America and elsewhere. So actually, if you look at most countries' studies, long-term studies of older people include measures of loneliness, and Britain actually, in contrast to that headline that said Britain is the loneliness capital of Europe, sadly, we're not even leading Europe on that. The loneliest countries in Europe are Spain, Italy, and Portugal. So where older people report 20-25% levels of loneliness, and the lowest levels of loneliness are in Scandinavia, where it's about 4 or 5%. So, and that reflects the fact that loneliness is culturally situated. It's what you expect. It's your expectation. So if I can get into the old stereotyping a bit, if you're an Italian mama and your son lives with you and you see him 15 times a day, you're lonely because you want to see him 20 times a day. If you're a mother in Oslo and you see your son twice a year, you're not lonely at all. So one of the really interesting things about cross-cultural loneliness studies, if you like, is the inclusion now of the countries of Eastern Europe. So the countries there that were formerly the former Soviet bloc countries, and they have astronomically high levels of loneliness amongst their older people, 35-40%, depending upon how you ask the question. And again, I suspect that reflects the changes in those countries since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if I knew where Tameside was, I'd come and visit.
Tameside?
Yeah.
Well, there you are. There's an invitation.
I've got a geography degree, but I didn't do that sort of geography.